Do you think this mailbox is as cheap as its owner? Marjorie Lexton, the arrogant HOA president in her blinding suit, shouted right in the middle of Oak Ridge Street. But just seconds later, her silver SUV slammed into the steel mailbox I had installed. The front of her car crumpled, while the mailbox stood firm like a dare. The whole neighborhood burst out laughing, and I just took a sip of coffee and said, "You just drove straight into justice." This wasn't just payback, it was a reminder. Never let those drunk on power think they're untouchable. What state are you in? And if you ran into a Marjorie like this, how would you strike back? I moved to Oak Ridge Estates with a simple belief this would be a place to start over. Quiet, clean, livable neighborhood. The houses lined up in perfect rows, lawns trimmed neatly, and the central lake reflected the afternoon sun like a giant mirror. But that surface beauty hid a truth every new resident would soon face. The HOA here operated like a shadow government, setting its own rules and, more importantly, forcing everyone to obey. The one at the top of that system was Marjorie Lexton. She needed no introduction. Her name and her behavior echoed throughout the neighborhood, enough to make people wary at the mere mention. The first day I met Marjorie, she appeared in a light-colored suit, walking slowly down the asphalt road, her eyes sweeping each house with the disdainful gaze of someone inspecting personal property. The way she held her head high, chin slightly raised, was her way of declaring to the entire community that the real power here rested in the hands of a woman passed, not in any court or public office. I stood on my porch, stacking a few moving boxes while quietly observing. Neighbors walking by would lower their eyes at the sight of Marjorie, pulling wagons into garages or slipping down side path. That tension needed no explanation. I understood clearly that she wasn't someone who let things slide, and the silence of the community was what fed her authority. Marjorie approached my house, her voice steady and cold as steel. "Mr. Thornhill, correct? I'm the HOA president here. I hope you understand Oak Ridge Estates has its own standard. If you want to live peacefully, you should adapt quickly." As she finished, her eyes landed on the slightly worn mailbox I hadn't yet replaced, and she gave a faint, condescending smile. In that moment, I felt the start of a conflict I had never wanted. I returned her greeting with a forced smile and polite words, but deep down, a small spark had been lit. Marjorie didn't welcome me as a new neighbor, didn't ask how I was settling in. She inspected, judged, and belittled me from the very first encounter. I brought the rest of my things inside, but couldn't escape her shadow, a shadow that hung like a whip waiting to snap. Her words became a warning, and that scornful gaze was the first spark in a series of coming clashes. I realized then I had stepped into a place where justice didn't belong to the law, but to the loudest voice. And in Oak Ridge Estates, that voice belonged to Marjorie Lexton. That morning, I was still fumbling with the stack of cardboard boxes piled by the porch when I heard a sharp metallic clang at the gate. Startled, I stepped out and saw Marjorie's silver SUV pulled up right at the edge of the road. A strip of paint had scraped off along the side of her car, and my mailbox was dented at one corner, leaning like it was about to fall. She glanced at me through the window, then stepped out without the slightest hint of concern. Marjorie looked at the mailbox, her lip curling into a sneer. She said flatly, her voice even but laced with mockery, "You should know the rules here." With that, she got back into her car, started the engine, and drove off, leaving behind the bent mailbox like a monument to her arrogance. I stood frozen for a few seconds, then bent down to touch the scraped paint, my fingers feeling the biting cold of twisted steel. Her words kept echoing in my head. No apology, no hint of embarrassment, only command and imposition. I sighed, telling myself maybe it was just an accident, but deep inside, a feeling of unease began to rise. I decided to prop the mailbox up temporarily so I could get on with my day. While I was driving a new wooden post into the ground, the man across the street, a middle-aged neighbor, peeked out from behind his fence and shook his head slightly. He looked at me with pity, then hurried back inside, as if afraid to be seen. That image told me this wasn't the first time something like this had happened in Oak Ridge. That evening, when my daughter came home from school, she asked why the mailbox looked so damaged. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full story, so I simply said someone had made a mistake. But in her eyes, I saw both worry and a faint fear. I didn't want to plant anxiety in her heart, but I knew she was smart enough to sense that something wasn't right about this place. A few days later, I crossed paths with Marjorie again. She was in the same light-colored suit, walking with the same commanding posture, as if patrolling her own territory. When she saw me repainting the wooden gate, she stopped, squinted at my work, and said blandly, "Let's hope you follow the guidelines this time." I didn't respond, just gave a half-hearted nod. But that restraint did nothing to calm the frustration growing inside me. I started hearing more stories from other families in the neighborhood. A single mother told me with a trembling voice that her teenage son had once been scolded by Marjorie in the middle of the street parking his bike too close to the curb. A retired man said he'd been fined hundreds of dollars for hanging a flag slightly off-center from the HOA's approved position. These fragments came together into a clearer picture. Marjorie wielded her power to control, to dominate, to make it known that Oak Ridge was a territory under her rule. I often wondered if she had ever faced any real push. The answer was in the eyes of those around me. They chose silence, closing doors quickly whenever the silver SUV passed by. They understood that standing up to Marjorie meant being branded a troublemaker, and in this place, that was enough to make life unbearable for any family. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, cup of cold coffee in my hand. I replayed the moment Marjorie said, "You should know the rules here." It wasn't a reminder, it was a message that I had stepped into a game where the rules existed only to serve whoever held the power. I kept my composure, but deep inside, a quiet sense of dread settled in, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface, waiting to break. I knew then that I had entered a battle I never asked for, and the opponent, Marjorie Lexton, was not the kind to stop at a scraped mailbox. That was only the opening move. A week passed, and just as I managed to install a new mailbox, it was smashed into splinters. That morning, when I opened the door, I saw the post leaning. The box lid flung all the way to the edge of the road. It felt as if someone had deliberately rolled a tire over it until everything buckled. What was meant to hold my family's letters had become someone else's plaything, and in Oak Ridge, who but Marjorie could have done it without a trace of fear? I had lost my patience. This time, I stopped her right in the middle of the asphalt street. As the silver SUV rolled to a slow halt, I walked straight toward it, my voice steady. "What did you do to my mailbox?" Marjorie lowered her window, the breeze tossing her golden hair slightly, but her eyes remained filled with disdain. She squinted past me at the broken post behind and said something that made my blood boil. "Your mailbox looked cheap. It didn't belong in this neighborhood." No. I stood there speechless for a few seconds. No denial, no attempt to pretend. That sentence was a brazen confession, turning destruction into mockery. I responded through clenched teeth. "That was my property. What gives you the right to destroy it?" Marjorie let out a soft laugh, not the cheerful kind, but a hiss through her teeth, bitter and sharp. Tilting her head, she added, "Right? Keep this place valuable and upscale. A cheap mailbox doesn't deserve to stand here." Her words poured into my ears like acid. I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. "Don't think everyone here is afraid of you," I said, each word heavy as lead. Marjorie didn't blink. She simply smirked and slammed the window shut. The silver SUV sped off, leaving behind a trail of pale smoke on the quiet road. I stood there, fist clenched, my heart pounding in my chest. That afternoon, I cleared the shattered wood, my chest burning with anger. Each broken piece cut into my pride like shards of glass. I wondered how many others in this neighborhood had endured the same. A black woman walking her dog paused for a moment, then whispered, "You're not the first." Her voice trembled, her eyes wide with fear, as if someone might overhear. Before I could reply, she hurried off with the dog. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of cold coffee. Marjorie's voice echoed in my head, every word like an insult. "Cheap mailbox. Doesn't belong in this neighborhood." This clearly wasn't about a simple object. This was about domination, about using power and contempt to grind others down. She hadn't attacked the mailbox, she had attacked my dignity, and more broadly, the dignity of anyone who didn't meet the standards she made up for herself. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed. The sound of Marjorie's car engine haunted my mind, like a steady drumbeat reminding me that this wasn't over. If I accepted silence, I'd become part of the invisible submission that had kept this neighborhood for years. But if I pushed back, I knew I'd be facing something dirtier. As the first light crept in, I stepped out onto the porch and looked at the wreckage where the mailbox once stood. That bare patch of dirt was a stain in the middle of the green lawn. I took a deep breath, the cold air sinking into my lungs. Deep down, I knew that patience would get me nowhere this time. Marjorie had drawn the battle line, and the moment she spat out that insult, there was no turning back. The second destroyed mailbox was a marker, a blatant challenge. I gathered the broken pieces and dumped them into the trash, and in that moment, I silently promised I wouldn't let myself become a victim again. Marjorie wanted to prove I didn't belong here, but it was her arrogance that made something clear. Oak Ridge Estates didn't need a self-appointed queen. It needed a lesson in justice, and that lesson, I would be the one to teach. When I confronted Marjorie in the street, a few neighbors stood not far away. An old woman watering her flowers, a young man walking his dog. They glanced over briefly, then dropped their eyes, pretending to focus on what they were doing to avoid meeting mine. That said more than words ever could. Everyone knew Marjorie was a source of trouble, and crossing her meant inviting chaos. No one wanted to stand with me, even though they all saw the tyranny happening right in front of them. My daughter stood beside me, her face confused and unsure. She had never seen an adult publicly humiliate her father like that. Her eyes were glassy, and her small hand gripped the hem of my shirt tightly. I swallowed my anger, refusing to let cruel words slip out in that moment. I was afraid she'd see her father as someone out of control, afraid that this would leave a mark to carry with her. Marjorie drove off, leaving behind a heavy silence. Crouched down and wrapped my arm around her shoulders, leading her back to the house. She didn't say a word during that short walk, just stared at the ground. I tried to stay composed, but each step weighed heavier on my chest. Once inside, she looked up and softly asked, "Why does she hate us so much?" I froze, unsure how to answer. A 12-year-old, shouldn't have to witness this. But Marjorie had turned everything into a public humiliation. That evening, I sat in the living room, watching the glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. The sound of Marjorie's car echoed again somewhere out on the road. Each time the engine noise rolled in, I saw my daughter flinch and glance toward the window. She didn't say anything, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. It hit me then. My silence wasn't just something I endured, it was something I was teaching her to imitate. The next morning, as I dropped her off at school, I noticed strange looks from a few other parents. Word of yesterday's confrontation had clearly gotten around. In Oak Ridge, nothing ever stayed behind closed doors. It spread like wildfire through dry grass, and the one caught in the center was always Marjorie's target. I pressed my lips together, gripped the steering wheel tighter, and in my mind a resolve took root. If I stayed silent, my daughter would grow up in a place poisoned by fear. That afternoon, as I passed by the spot where the mailbox had been shattered, I stopped for a long time. Bits of broken wood still lay scattered across the grass. I looked down, then looked up and saw a few houses across the street with curtains slightly parted. They were watching, but no one came out. In that moment, I swore I would never let my daughter see her father bow his head again. Marjorie sowed contempt, using power and fear, but I would find a way to break it. In my daughter's eyes, I knew the time had come to change. That month's HOA meeting was held in a small hall next to the Central Park. Chairs were lined up neatly in rows, with a podium and microphone at the front. I sat in the middle row, expecting nothing more than updates on playground maintenance and roadside grass, but as if rehearsed, Marjorie stepped to the podium, adjusted her papers, and looked straight at me. She didn't mince words. "Families like yours drag down the value of this neighborhood," Marjorie said clearly, deliberately stressing the word, "your." The air tightened. I saw a few people glance in my direction, then quickly turn away, pretending to study the notebooks in their lap. Her gaze swept across my face, pausing just long enough to etch in the message. The words seemed to refer to property up, but everyone knew what she really meant. This had nothing to do with home value. It was about skin, about origin, about my very presence in this place. My heart pounded, my hand clenched tightly on my knee. My daughter sat beside me, curling inward, her face flushed with shame. I saw her stifle a breath, her eyes drifting down to the floor. I hadn't wanted her to witness her father being made a target in front of an entire room, but Marjorie had put me there. A board member, Mr. Dennis, stumbled through an awkward suggestion. "Maybe we should discuss the budget first." Marjorie waved him off with a flick of her hand, her thin lips curling into a victorious smile. "Budget or not, none of it matters if we keep letting the wrong people squeeze in. Look around, every house is welcome." And then, he brings it all down. The hall fell silent. I looked around, and the familiar faces of the neighborhood all avoided my eye. No one objected, no one spoke. That silence was complicity. I wanted to stand, slam my hand on the table, and shout back that I had paid my dues like everyone else, that my family had every right to live here. But my daughter's hand gripped mine, her eyes begging me to stay calm. I swallowed my fury, even as my chest burned with rage. Marjorie stepped down from the podium with triumphant poise. As she passed, she leaned in just enough for me to hear, "If you can't take it, the door's always open." That sentence, paired with her look of pure contempt, cut like a cold blade into my pride. The meeting went on as if nothing had happened. People discussed repairs to the poolside awning, budgets for planting flowers along the entrance. Everything moved along like Marjorie's insult had never existed, but in my head, playing on loop, each bitter word pounding against my dignity. I looked over at my daughter and saw her slumped forward, her hands covering the small note brought. My heart ached. I wasn't just enduring humiliation, I was letting my child see her father bow to arrogance. As the meeting ended, Marjorie walked past me, heels striking the floor, a smug smirk on her face that made no effort to hide her triumph. I heard her voice clearly low enough that no one else would notice, but loud enough that I couldn't miss it. "One day, you'll leave this place on your own." Then she walked on, like someone who had just finished a performance. I came home with a heavy heart. My daughter was silent the entire ride back, didn't ask questions, didn't look at me. Only once she got to her room did she say, in a voice, "I hate her." I nodded, but I couldn't find a single word to ease the anger in her chest. I knew she was learning a twisted lesson that tyranny could win when everyone else stayed silent. The next morning, I opened the door to grab the paper. The sight before me stopped me cold. The new mailbox I had installed less than 2 weeks ago had been completely crushed. Post snapped in half, the address plaque bent, twisted. Tire marks ran deep into the wet grass, leading back to the edge of the road. I didn't need to guess only one person had both the cruelty and the power to do this so openly: Marjorie. I stood there for a long time, hands shaking, then slowly pulled out my phone and took photo after photo. Not because I planned to show the police, I knew the HOA bylaws shield her in a dozen ways. I took those photos for myself, so that whenever I felt that old patience creeping in again, I'd remember that she had turned me into her entertainment. As I set up a makeshift mailbox so the mail carrier would have somewhere to leave letters, a few neighbors walked by. They glanced at the scene, then picked up their pace, as if afraid to step into the mess. An old man walking his dog slowed just a bit, sighed, then muttered something I couldn't quite hear. Whether it was sympathy sympathy or a warning, I no longer cared. All I saw was the truth: everyone here had learned to live with abuse of power. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the photo set in front of me. Across from me, my daughter sat quietly, her eyes red from holding it in all day. Finally, she asked, "Are you just going to let her do whatever she wants?" Froze. That question hit me like a blade, driven straight into my conscience. I had held back to keep the peace, to protect her from trouble. But it was that same silence that made her feel humiliated on my behalf. I placed my hand over the photo, the jagged edges of shattered wood seeming to press into my skin. I knew it then. Marjorie hadn't just destroyed a mailbox. She was sending a message, loud and clear, and daring me to respond. And from that moment on, I understood that staying still was no longer an option. Because if I bowed my head one more time, I'd lose the respect of the one person who mattered most. If it were you, would you keep your head down or stand up right then and there? One late afternoon, just as I stepped outside, I saw Marjorie pull her silver SUV right up to the patch of land in front of my house. The tire was nearly touching the base of the temporary mailbox I had put up the day before. Her window rolled down, and she leaned one elbow on the steering wheel, her eyes glinting with mockery. Then she said, drawing out each word, "Let's see how long you can take it." That sentence cut straight through whatever patience I had left. Blood rushed to my face, and I shouted, "Are you insane?" The words burst from my chest and echoed through the still air. Porch lights flicked on in nearby houses, and curtains stirred. People were watching. Marjorie didn't flinch. In fact, she smiled, her mouth curling with contempt. "Insane?" she replied slowly, her voice dripping with venom. "Preserving community values is an illness, then yes, I have it. And if you can't handle it, maybe you should ask yourself whether you belong here at all." I stepped closer. Only a few feet separated us now. I stared at her, my mind flashing through images of the shattered mailbox, the insult at the HOA meeting, and now this brazen provocation. I clenched my jaw, every muscle tightening, but in that moment, I thought of my daughter inside the house. She could walk out at any second, and I didn't want her to see her father lose control. I held back, exhaled hard, but my eyes never left hers. "You're going to pay for the way you treat people," I said, low but firm. The tone made sure she heard every word. Marjorie sat calmly behind the wheel, her hand resting casually on the steering wheel, then smirked and let out a line that made my blood boil. "I am the law here. If you don't like it, sell your house." Each word hit like a slap to the face, unfiltered, unapologetic. She said it with total certainty, as if this entire neighborhood was her private property. My body burned, fury rising like a firestorm. My hands shook not from fear, but from restraint. A part of me wanted to strike back right then and there, but reason held me. I knew if I gave in, she'd have exactly what she wanted, a reason to label me a threat and use the HOA to tighten the noose around my family. I took a deep breath, but my eyes stayed locked on hers. "You didn't write the law," I growled, each word heavy. Marjorie laughed, a sharp, sneering sound through clenched teeth, then slammed her window shut. The engine roared as the SUV peeled away, leaving me standing in the empty street, my heart pounding like war drum. I went back inside. My daughter ran up to me, asking quickly, "What happened, Dad?" I looked at her face and saw the worry written all over it. I didn't want her to see her father cornered. I placed a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "It's nothing, go do your homework." But inside me, the fire had already started to burn. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a notebook. I began writing down each incident by date, from the first time the mailbox was dented, to the public humiliation at the meeting, to the words, "I am the law here." Each line became an unspoken vow that I would not let that contempt go unanswered. I started reading through state regulations, scanning every clause related to property rights and vandalism. The more I read, the clearer it became that Marjorie had built her power on the silence of others. I remembered the neighbors who had looked away the day before. They knew, but they were afraid, and that fear was the fuel that fed the creature named Marjorie. I set the notebook down and looked around my small house. This was the home I had worked hard to build for my daughter, the place where she should feel safe and proud. Yet after just a few weeks here, we had become someone's amusement. That thought hardened my anger. It was no longer a flare-up, but a decision. The next day, I stuck to the routine, dropped my daughter off at school, greeted a few neighbors, but there was something different in my eyes. I no longer looked down. I didn't avoid anyone. I knew Marjorie was watching from somewhere, and I wanted her to see that I was no longer silent. When I got home, I stood in front of the broken mailbox and placed my hand on the cracked wood. The image of Marjorie in her car, smirking as she declared, "I am the law here," echoed in my mind. I let out a quiet laugh. If she wanted to be the law, I would show her what real justice looked like. In my head, the pieces of a plan began to fall into place. Not an impulsive move, but something steady, solid, something that would leave her with no way out. I knew I had to be patient, but I also knew the game had changed. From the moment Marjorie claimed to be the law, I had turned resolve into a weapon. I didn't tell anyone, not even my daughter. I only knew that if I stayed quiet, it would never end. The more Marjorie thrived on fear, the more she believed power was absolute. But I had made up my mind next time, she wouldn't have the chance to smirk. That night, I lay awake, flooded with thoughts. Each time Marjorie had insulted me played on repeat, and her voice, "Let's see how long you can take it," kept ringing. I knew the time for endurance was over. From that day forward, I was no longer the passive one. Marjorie had chosen the battlefield, and I would be ready to meet her on it. Ever since the day Marjorie arrogantly declared, "I am the law here," I knew I couldn't let things go on her way. I began taking photos of every incident: the smashed mailbox, the tire tracks carved into the grass, the scattered shards of broken wood. I stored them in a separate folder, carefully labeled with dates and time. Each image was no longer just evidence, but a blade carving into memory, a reminder that I was living under the contempt of a self-appointed queen. Every night, after my daughter had gone to bed, I sat at the table and read through state property laws. I searched clause by clause, especially those concerning vandalism within HOA-governed communities. The deeper I dug, clearer it became that Marjorie could not hide behind the excuse of protecting neighborhood standards forever. The law granted residents the right to defend legitimate property, and that meant I could fight back without stepping outside the rules. I jotted down key statutes, underlining line by line. It felt like preparing for a long campaign, where the weapons were not fists, but patience and understanding. Each page slowly turned into a blueprint in my mind. I was no longer just thinking about rebuilding a mailbox, I was thinking about making it a statement, a declaration that Marjorie's scorn wouldn't be repeated. Some nights I couldn't sleep, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, picturing Marjorie parking next to my mailbox, that mocking smile on her face. I felt the anger building, steady and dense, like water piling behind a dam ready to burst. Sooner or later, it would. And when it did, it would wash away the throne she had built for herself. During the day, I remained composed. I took my daughter to school, greeted neighbors, and even smiled at a few familiar faces. But in my mind, everything pointed to one goal: not to become a victim again. I kept these plans hidden from my daughter because she needed a calm father, not someone consumed by resentment. Sometimes, when passing my house, Marjorie would glance over with her cold stare and familiar smirk. I didn't respond, I just held her gaze long enough to let her know that my silence had changed. I saw her hesitate slightly, then quicken her step, but I knew she still believed she ruled this neighborhood. In the following days, I organized all my notes into a small file. Every page, every photo, was a reminder that I had come too far to turn back. The hatred had shifted, it was no longer a flash of fury, but a driving force, fuel for what was coming. I closed the folder, and felt a certainty I had never known before. Once, all I wanted was peace, to settle in like any other family. But Marjorie had erased that option. She spread contempt, and now, I would return the lesson in a way she would never see coming. From the notes and folder of photos I had compiled, an idea slowly began to form. It didn't strike like lightning, it glowed to life like a coal catching flame, quietly, but growing stronger by the day. I started to envision a mailbox that Marjorie could never bring down. Not a flimsy wooden post, or a thin metal box, but a solid structure so tough that any tire daring to touch it would pay the price. At night, as I washed my face and looked in the mirror, I saw something new in my eye, a brightness that had been missing since I first arrived in Oak Ridge. I whispered to myself, not as a threat, but as a promise: she's going to pay. From that moment, I understood that my plan wasn't just anger, it was a calculated counterstrike. In the days that followed, I quietly researched materials. I went online, reading dozens of articles about reinforcing steel posts, pouring concrete underground to form a solid base. I wasn't looking for anything exotic, only materials I could pick up at the local hardware store, enough to build something that looked like a normal mailbox, but could stand as a defensive wall. The deeper I dug, the more I felt myself slipping back into an old rhythm, the instincts of someone who had once been an engineer in the military, someone used to calculating stress loads and sabotage resist. By day, I kept up appearances. I took my daughter to school, went grocery shopping, and exchanged small talk with a few friendly neighbors. But in my mind, every detail of the mailbox was becoming defined: how tall the steel post needed to be, how deep the concrete base should go, how the wooden shell would disguise the real structure inside. I wanted everything to be fully legal and discreet, so that when Marjorie struck again, she'd suffer the consequences, with no one to blame but herself. At night, I opened my notebook and sketched rough outlines. From the outside, it looked like any other wooden post, but inside was a thick steel core, buried deep like a foundation pillar. I calculated the angle, imagined the silver SUV slamming into it, front end crumpling while the mailbox remained standing. That image looped in my mind, turning my rage into something almost exhilarating. Once, my daughter walked into the room and caught me sketching on a sheet of paper. She asked, "What are you working on?" I smiled, tore the page out, and slipped it into the drawer. "Just a few ideas," I said. I didn't want her to know everything, but in my heart I thought, one day you'll see your father won't let this humiliation pass. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror, tightening my tie, getting ready for work. In the reflection, I looked into my own eyes, sharp, alert. I realized I had changed. I was no longer the father who stayed quiet, keep the peace. I saw fire. I saw resolve. Marjorie had started this, and I was ready to answer. I left the house with that thought burning in my mind. Every time I looked at the flimsy mailbox by the gate, I felt the full weight of the shame I was carrying. But at the same time, I saw a vision of what was coming. A steel mailbox standing tall and proud. A monument to resistance against arrogance. And I knew that day wasn't far off. I began to act quietly, choosing a weekend morning when most of Oak Ridge's residents were still tucked inside their home. I drove out to a hardware store on the outskirts of town, picking up thick steel rods, several bags of cement, and the tools I'd need. When the store clerk asked what I was building, I gave a vague reply, just fixing a few things around the house. He nodded, unconcerned. I loaded everything into the truck bed, my heart pounding as if I were preparing for a covert mission. Back home, I set up a large tarp to shield the mailbox area, pretending it was just another small project. To avoid attention, I kept the outer wooden shell intact, only replacing a few panels that looked decorative. But beneath that shell, I dug deep into the ground, just wide enough to pour a concrete base. I mixed the cement into a dense slab, drove the steel post down into it, and packed it tight. Every shovel of dirt, every layer that sealed it in, was like a heartbeat pounding louder. I knew Marjorie would return, and this time, her silver SUV would meet resistance. Neighbors passed by from time to time, some paused to glance over, and I greeted them with a polite smile. Just repainting it, the old mailbox looked too worn, I explained. They nodded and moved on quickly. I watched them go, thinking how no one dared to ask more. They feared drawing Marjorie's attention, and that only confirmed for me that this plan had to remain absolutely quiet. By late afternoon, sweat soaking through my shirt, I finished installing the steel core, covered it with a new wooden exterior. From a distance, it looked like any ordinary mailbox, but I knew it concealed a concrete mass weighing hundreds of pounds, buried like a foundation into the earth. I stepped back and took a deep breath, feeling a strange and satisfying thrill. No one but me knew the truth. That night I sat alone on the porch, staring at the new mailbox. It stood there plainly, silent beside the walkway, but to me it was a declaration. I sipped my coffee, picturing Marjorie's face the moment she realized she no longer had the upper hand. The image made me smile for the first time since moving to Oak Ridge. I felt like I had reclaimed control. The next day, I pretended to finish the job. I held a brush and slowly applied a coat of light gray paint, moving with the rhythm of a dutiful homeowner. Occasionally, I wiped sweat from my forehead, glancing around to be sure no one suspected anything. My daughter stepped outside and asked, "What are you doing, Dad?" I patted her head and said softly, "Just making it stronger." She smiled and ran back inside, never suspecting the steel trap hidden in plain sight. That evening, once everything was complete, I gave it one last inspection. The mailbox post didn't budge. The surface was smooth. The paint had dried to a clean, even gloss. I sat on the porch chair, feeling both relief and anticipation. Marjorie had pushed me too many times, and I knew her nature. She wouldn't stop. She would try again, with her usual arrogance, and when she did, she'd meet the retaliation I had crafted in silence. In the faint reflection on the window pane, I caught a glimpse of my own face. It no longer held the weary look of a man tolerating abuse. My eyes were sharp, burning with focus. I murmured, final vow spoken aloud. "That's enough, Marjorie. This time, it's your turn to pay." As the final coat of paint dried, I leaned against the mailbox, my hands still sore and dusted with cement. On the outside, it looked no different from any other mailbox in Oak Ridge Estate, but I knew exactly what was hidden inside. A steel and concrete core capable of withstanding far more than the impact of a silver SUV. Standing there, I found myself drifting back to my past, the years I spent as a military engineer, designing fortifications that could resist even heavy artillery fire. The memories returned vividly, as if they had happened just yesterday. I remembered the dense schematics, the clang of metal in the fabrication bays, and the feeling of accomplishment when a structure stood tall on the test field. That work had once filled me with pride, but it also carried weight, because even the smallest miscalculation could bring everything down. Now, that experience had become my advantage, transforming a modest mailbox into a hidden fortress right at my front gate. I smiled, a mix of bitterness and pride curling on my lips. "Marjorie would never guess who I really am," I whispered. To her, I was just another new resident, quiet man living alone with his daughter, easy to mock and push around. But the truth was, I had worked on systems 100 times more complex. And now, I was using that knowledge to face down someone who wielded hollow power like it meant something. That evening, I sat on the porch, the yellow glow of the street lamp spilling across the silent road. My daughter was asleep, the house still, with only the chirp of crickets breaking the quiet. I looked over at the new mailbox. It stood there quietly, but to me, it felt like a sentry on watch. I pictured the moment Marjorie would once again drive her car into it, and the image of her crumpled front end made me smile faintly. Throughout my career, I had faced all kinds of opposition, complex calculations, brutal testing conditions, but I had never encountered a conflict this personal. There were no ranks here, no orders, just a man protecting his dignity and a woman who believed she was the rules. And in this fight, I knew the weaker one wasn't me. The next morning, morning, while driving my daughter to school, we passed Marjorie's house. She stood in the yard, speaking with a few other residents. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and she smirked, as if to remind me who held the power. I didn't react, just kept driving, calm. Inside, I knew the moment she tasted the backlash was coming, and I didn't need to put on a show to prove it. That afternoon, I checked every weld, every joint on the mailbox. I tapped lightly on the wooden shell, and heard the solid echo from inside. That sound reassured me. I dried my hands, sat down, and took a deep breath. Everything was ready. Now, all that was left was for Marjorie to walk right into the trap she had laid for herself with nothing but arrogance leading the way. In the mirror, when I looked into my own eyes, I saw the reflection of someone who had stepped away from quiet endurance and into a real fight. There was no fear left, no more bowed head in submission, only the cold stare of a man ready to strike back. I spoke softly, as if closing the final chapter of my preparation. You think you are the law. Then let's see if the law of steel and concrete is stronger than your arrogant mouth. Let's see if the law of steel and concrete is stronger than your arrogant mouth. The HOA meeting took place on a sweltering afternoon in the familiar hall by the park. I sat in the third row, prepared to hear the usual talk about playgrounds, streetlights, pool maintenance. But as always, Marjorie found a way to turn the meeting into her personal stage. She stood at the podium, her voice loud and theatrical, her eyes flicking toward me, then pausing with loaded intent. He won't last, that mailbox will be gone soon, Marjorie declared in front of the entire neighborhood. She didn't have to say my name. Everyone knew who she meant. Front row, packed with her loyal clique, erupted in laughter. Heads dipped, eyes darted away. Silence fell across the rest of the room, the kind born not of agreement, but of fear. No one wanted to challenge her, even when her arrogance was so naked, it bordered on absurd. I sat still, hands clasped on the table, my expression calm. The anger inside me was no longer hot, it had cooled into something sharp and deliberate. I didn't respond, didn't defend myself. I let the laughter echo, let her believe she was winning. Because I knew, just outside that room, the mailbox she was mocking had changed. It was no longer something she could with ease. It was a hidden trap of steel, and she had no idea. Marjorie went on with her speech, dressing it up, talk of community values and preserving standards. But it was nothing more than a cover for her inflated ego. Every time she paused, her followers nodded along, punctuating her words with dry applause. I took it all in, realizing just how long Oak Ridge Estates had been suffocating under this air of fear. When the meeting broke for recess, an elderly resident approached me and whispered, "Don't take it personally. We know she's out of line, but no one dares speak up." He spoke quickly and walked away just as fast, as if afraid to be seen. His words didn't upset me. If anything, they strengthened my resolve. People were silent out of fear, and it was that very fear that allowed Marjorie to grow bolder with passing day. I returned to my seat, my eyes meeting my daughter's in the row behind. She looked at me, wide-eyed and quiet, as if to ask, "What are you going to do?" I nodded gently, reassuring her. I didn't need to say anything. She knew I wasn't backing down. At the end of the meeting, Marjorie walked past my row, her voice low but taunting. "You'd better be ready. Next time, that mailbox won't stand a chance." I looked up and met her eyes, only smiling. I didn't reply because deep down I knew her downfall was close. That smug grin, that arrogant confidence, would make her careless. And it would be that very carelessness that brought her to an end she never saw coming. I left the hall and stepped into the cool air outside. Instead of bitterness, I felt an odd sense of calm. Marjorie wanted the community to believe I was weak, that I would break. But the truth was, she was walking herself closer to the trap. And I didn't need to explain, didn't need to argue. All I had to do was wait for the moment justice would show itself in front of everyone. That night, when I returned home, I sat once again on the porch, staring at the steel mailbox, standing solid under the glow of the street lamp. It stood there calmly, no different from how I had sat through the meeting, silent, waiting, and ready to swallow Marjorie's laughter whole. In my mind, I heard myself whisper, "This game is almost over, Marjorie, and this time, you're the one who's going to lose." Since that day, the atmosphere in Oak Ridge had shifted. The once quiet neighborhood now buzzed with murmurs. No one spoke directly. Through their glances, I knew they were waiting. Every time I stepped into the yard, a few neighbors would glance at the new mailbox, then quickly look away. They didn't dare ask, but it was clear everyone wanted to know whether Marjorie would dare pull her stunt again. The usual silence had thickened into a fog that hung over the entire community. One afternoon, I happened to overhear two women talking by the alley. One said softly, her voice shaky, "If Marjorie really does it again, and something happens, she'll lose everything." The other replied quietly, "But who's going to stop? We all know how she island." As they spoke, they looked back in my direction, then quickly fell silent. I didn't say a word, just smiled faintly. Just as I had thought, everyone was watching. My daughter could feel the tension too. She came home saying her classmates had overheard their parents mentioning the mailbox. She asked me, "Are you sure she'll stop this time?" I patted her head and answered simply, "There will come a day when she can't do it anymore." I didn't explain, but I knew that to her, trust in me mattered more than any details I could give. In the days that followed, I kept my routine, but the waiting made the air feel heavier than ever. In the mornings, as I stepped into the yard, I saw curtains shift slightly, neighbors peeking through. At night, when I took the trash out, lights flicked on suddenly, as if someone wanted to keep watch. The whole neighborhood had turned into an audience, and Marjorie and I were now the leads in a drama she believed she still directed. Sometimes I saw Marjorie walking by, same pale suit, same haughty stride, but I noticed something uneasy in her step. Maybe she had sensed I was no longer someone she could push around, but her ego wouldn't let her retreat. The more she felt the pressure to prove she was still in control, the more certain I became that she would walk straight into her final mistake. And so the days passed, tight as a drawn string. I didn't rush, didn't make a move. I let everything unfold on its own because I understood Marjorie's nature. For someone addicted to power, my silence was the loudest provocation of all. She wouldn't be able to stand seeing me calm, unshaken, still here, and at some point, she would act, and when she did, she'd face the consequences in front of all the people who had once bowed their heads and stayed silent. In those days, Oakridge felt like a stage right before the curtain dropped. Neighbors avoided the subject, but in their eyes was a vague sense of anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to happen, they just didn't know when. I looked around and saw it clearly. Every face held the same expression, waiting. And I knew that when the moment came, the entire neighborhood would witness the truth that Marjorie was not the law, not a queen, but a pride fraud who would finally kneel before justice. That morning opened with a deceptively calm air. Sunlight spread across the pavement, sparrows chirped along the fence, and dew still clung to the grass, glistening like strands of silver. I sat on the porch, coffee steaming in my hand, eyes fixed on the familiar road that led to the entrance of Oakridge. Inside me was stillness, but beneath it, attention stretched tight like a bow drawn to its limit. I knew the moment would come. I just didn't know which day it would arrive. The sound of an engine roared from a distance, and I frowned slightly. That sound was unmistakable, the silver SUV. It grew louder, pounding like war drums. In an instant, the peaceful morning air was torn apart. My daughter poked her head out from inside the house, but I raised a hand to signal her to step back. Her eyes were full of worry, but she understood her father was bracing for something inevitable. The silver SUV came barreling in at a speed no residential street called for. I saw Marjorie behind the wheel, her face twisted in hatred, eyes burning with the urge to destroy anything in her way. She jerked the steering wheel, aiming straight for the new mailbox. Crack! The impact rang out, brutal and sharp, enough to make nearby houses tremble. The sound of crumpling metal mixed with shattering glass. The SUV's front end folded in, the hood popped open like it had been snapped off, and white smoke spewed from the crack. And right there, in front of everyone, the mailbox I had built stood tall, unmoved, as solid as forged steel. A few neighbors rushed out of their homes, mouths agape. One clutched his chest, another couldn't help but let out a low laugh. The murmurs began softly, then grew louder. Oh my God, she really did it. Look at that, it didn't even budge. Marjorie staggered out of the car, face flushed red, hair wild. She turned toward the mailbox, eyes blazing with rage, as if the inanimate object personally insulted her pride. Her lips trembled, ready to scream something, but all that escaped heavy, labored breathing. I calmly lifted my cup, took a sip, and said clearly enough for all to hear, "You just drove straight into justice." The words through the air, cold as a blade slicing through her crumbling arrogance. A few neighbors burst into laughter. Others clapped. The applause wasn't loud, but it was enough to drain the color from Marjorie's face. She whipped around to face me, her voice cracking with fury. "You set me up. This was your trap." I stood, stepped slowly off the porch, my gaze fixed on her. "No, Marjorie. I built a mailbox strong enough to protect my property. And you just proved your arrogance isn't strong enough to bend justice." Oh. The neighbor named Dennis, who once avoided confrontation, now stepped out of his gate and shouted, "That's right." Everyone saw her drive straight into it. That unexpected show of support made Marjorie falter, a flicker of confusion flashing in her eyes. She was used to silence and lowered gazes, and now, with someone daring to speak up, her grip on control began to slip. I took a few steps forward, my voice steady. "You like to think you are the law, but real law isn't in your hand. It's here, in everyone's eyes, in the truth this entire neighborhood just witnessed." I paused, pointing to the now mangled silver SUV. "And right now, the truth is, you destroyed yourself." Crowd grew thicker, phones rose, screens flashing like tiny spotlights. I knew those videos would soon spread across social media, turning this moment into undeniable proof. Marjorie stood frozen, eyes wide as she scanned the crowd, as if searching for a sympathetic glance. But all she found were indifferent faces, some even smiling with satisfaction. My daughter stepped onto the porch, took in the scene, then turned to look at me. In her eyes, I saw trust and a quiet sense of vindication. I gave her a small nod, then turned back to Marjorie. "What were you trying to prove? That your power untouchable? Look at that car. Then look at this mailbox. Which one stood its ground, and which one fell apart?" Marjorie opened her mouth, but no words came. With each passing second, she seemed to shrink under the weight of the community's gaze. Pride that once fueled her had now crumpled like crushed hood of her SUV. I lifted my coffee cup, took another sip, and delivered the final line that made the crowd murmur in unison. "You thought you could crush me, but it turns out, you only crushed crushed yourself. In that moment, I knew I had reclaimed everything Marjorie had tried to take from me. My dignity, my respect, and my voice in this community. She might still flail in denial, but the truth was undeniable now, and no one could save her from it. That moment, what would you have wanted me to say to finish her off? The horrifying crash of the silver SUV into the mailbox still echoed through the air when doors along the street flew open. Neighbors rushed out, joggers halted mid-stride, and children poked their heads out of windows. No one remained indifferent anymore. Phones were raised instantly, screens flashing rapidly. Laughter erupted everywhere, some covered their mouths, others laughed out loud, creating a wave of collective exhilaration unseen before in Oak Ridge Estate. A middle-aged woman who I'd seen avoiding eye contact whenever Marjorie passed, now openly raised her phone to record, her voice trembling with glee. Oh my, did she really crash into that mailbox by herself? A young man burst out laughing. That's exactly what she deserved. The chatter overlapped. Everyone was desperate to capture every second of it. Marjorie stood staggered beside her mangled car, face red with rage and humiliation. She raised a hand as if to shield her face. Camera flashes kept exposing her. In that instant, the powerful woman she always pretended to be was reduced to a public laughingstock, right in front of the very people she had long forced to bow their head. The scene didn't stay on that street. A few hours later, the first video hit social media. A neighborhood account posted it with a simple caption: "When the HOA thinks she is the law and meets her match from a mailbox." The video spread like wildfire. Comments poured in. Instant karma. That mailbox deserves a medal. She got what she asked for. I sat inside, watching through the window as groups of people gathered outside. A few young neighbors burst into long fits of laughter, reading out loud the latest comments on their phone. Someone joked, "Maybe this mailbox deserves a place in the record book." The atmosphere in the neighborhood, once heavy with fear of Marjorie, had transformed into a fairground of justice, where everyone found delight in her spectacular fall from grace. My daughter stood by my side, eyes wide as she watched it all unfold. She gently tugged my arm and whispered, "Dad, people are finally on our side." I nodded and gazed out, feeling the truth clearly. Silence had shattered, and the community had finally found its voice through laughter, through applause. An elderly man who had once sighed in defeat now clapped, his face alight with relieved joy. Marjorie tried to shout back, her voice lost in the uproar. "You can't film this. This is slander." But nobody listened. Laughter drowned her out. Applause surged louder, each clap driving a nail into the hollow throne she had built. I quietly sipped my coffee, realizing that this moment wasn't just mine, it was for everyone who had ever been humiliated by her. As night fell, the video of Marjorie crashing into the mailbox had already reached thousands of views. People from beyond Oak Ridge were leaving comments, calling it a public sentence for an abuser of power. I sat in the living room, listening to the constant vibration of my phone as messages poured in from residents. "We support you." She finally got what she deserved. The Oak Ridge community, long stifled by silence, finally burst open. The applause, cheers, and laughter would echo long after that silver SUV was towed away. And I knew, from that moment forward, the balance of power in this neighborhood had begun to shift. Marjorie was no longer the shadow everyone avoided. She had made herself into a public joke, and the entire online world was now watching. In less than a day, the video of Marjorie's silver SUV slamming into the steel mailbox had spread across every social media platform. I didn't have to search, it came to me. Link after link, message after message, from people both inside and outside the neighborhood. The comments flooded in, and the line repeated more than any other was, "She deserved it." That phrase echoed like a declaration, each person adding their voice to a chorus of outrage and vindication. Several accounts even clipped the moment I calmly took a sip of coffee, captioning it, "The calmest man in Oak." The image of the mailbox standing firm amidst the wreckage of the SUV quickly became a symbol. Some called it the Justice Mailbox. Others added dramatic soundtracks to emphasize the irony. The wave of attention was more than I had imagined. I could only sit and watch, feeling both relieved and bitter, realizing it took a scene so disastrous for this community to finally speak out. Meanwhile, Marjorie became the epicenter of mockery. Anyone who had once been under her thumb now found joy in her downfall. But for Marjorie herself, the humiliation was constant. She had screamed at the scene, her face flushed like fire, hands trembling with rage. "This was a setup. He trapped me," she shouted, her voice hoarse as she tried to shout over the crowd's laughter. No one answered. People only moved their phones closer, capturing every second of her fake authority crumbling. Some residents whispered, stifling laughter until it spilled out anyway. Marjorie's fury looked no different than a drunk, scrambling for escape in a pit of mud she had dug herself. I stood there, my gaze calm, offering no justification. I didn't need to, everything was already crystal clear. Crumpled hood of the SUV was the only answer needed to every lie ever told. The truth stood unshaken, undeniable, and every scream Marjorie let out only made her look more pitiful. The tow truck arrived, dragging the silver SUV from the scene. Metal screeched as the wheels carved ugly trails into the pavement. Marjorie kept flailing, her voice looping the same threat over and over. "You'll all pay for this." Every one of you will regret it. But no one looked afraid. On the contrary, someone sneered. The only one who should regret anything is you. As the SUV disappeared around the corner, crowd began to disperse, but the energy lingered. People chatted, planning to watch the video online that evening. My daughter walked beside me, whispering, "You won." I squeezed her hand gently, saying nothing. Because this victory wasn't a simple joy, it was the beginning of a much bigger reckoning. That night, I sat in front of my computer, watching the share count spike. Comments poured in from all over, some offering support, others recounting their own bitter experiences with HOA across different states. I realized the story had outgrown Oak Ridge. It had become a warning shot against the abuse of power by boards meant to serve residents, but twisted into tools of oppression. As for Marjorie, I imagined her somewhere inside that oversized house, seething alone, phone vibrating nonstop with hundreds of mocking messages, her face flushed, her heartbeat erratic, and yet she couldn't stop the tide crashing over her, and I knew her reign over Oak Ridge had entered its final chapter. 2 days after the crash, while the story about Marjorie was still spreading across social media, a car from the local news station pulled up right in front of my house. The station's logo was clearly printed on the door. A young reporter stepped out, holding a microphone, followed by a cameraman carrying his rig. They approached, smiling politely, before introducing the purpose of their visit. "We'd like to learn more about the incident drawing so much attention in Oak Ridge," she said, her tone both courteous and eager. I led them into the yard and pointed toward the mailbox. It still stood firm, as solid as the day I built it. Around it, tire marks remained etched into the grass. The cameraman panned slowly from the mailbox to the oil-stained patch where the crushed SUV had once rested. I stood nearby, ready to recount everything. I began with the first time the mailbox dented, then the second time it was crushed, and the public insults during the HOA meeting. I left out no details, not the contempt in Marjorie's eyes, not the tone she used to mock me in front of the crowd. It wasn't random vandalism, I said firmly. It was deliberate, repeated, and intended to humiliate and intimidate. No, the reporter nodded constantly, her eyes widening when I mentioned how Marjorie had publicly declared during the meeting that the mailbox wouldn't last. I handed them the folder of photographs I had been compiling for weeks. Close-up shots of tired, shattered wood, all organized in chronological order. The cameraman recorded carefully, as if capturing each piece of evidence for the viewers. "What were you thinking when you rebuilt the mailbox that final time?" the reporter asked. I looked at the quiet iron box standing by the gate and answered, "I just wanted to protect my property. I wasn't looking to attack anyone, but I also couldn't allow arrogance to trampling on my family's dignity." The answer made her pause for a few seconds. Then she turned to the camera and whispered to her colleague, "This is exactly what the audience wants to hear." I understood then, this wasn't just a personal conflict anymore, it was becoming a symbol of resistance against abusive authority. When the interview ended, I walked them to the gate. A few neighbors lingered nearby, pretending to water plants or sweep the driveway, but their eyes remained fixed on it. I heard one woman whisper, "He spoke up for all of us." Another nodded, a hint of respect in her gaze. That evening, the local news aired the segment. Footage of the crushed silver SUV filled the screen, followed by a clip of me recounting the events. The anchor's voice rang out clearly. An Oak Ridge resident becomes the center of attention after building a mailbox to stand against prolonged harassment by the HOA president. Within an hour, my phone began ringing non-stop calls from friends in other states, and messages from strangers offering words of support. My daughter sat beside me, her eyes lighting up as she saw her father appear on the screen. She turned and whispered, "You made the whole world see she was wrong." I smiled faintly, but a sense of foreboding stirred in me. Marjorie wasn't the type to let go easily. The incident had become news, which meant she would do everything in her power to salvage whatever image she had left, and I knew the real storm was still waiting ahead. Right after the evening news aired, my neighbors began sharing additional footage they had captured. A man who lived directly across the street, usually detached from neighborhood affairs, suddenly brought over a clip from his porch security camera. In the footage, Marjorie's silver SUV was caught in full clarity from the moment it surged forward, tires tearing up the grass, to the thunderous crash into the steel mailbox. There was no room for ambiguity or excuse. I sat with the reporter watching the playback, the impact's roar sending chills down my spine. Cameraman nodded, muttering, "This is ironclad. There's no dodging this." I knew then, Marjorie had no more moves to make. The video was being shared everywhere, spliced with interview segments and shots of the unmoved mailbox. She once thrived on the silence of a subdued community, wielding it like a weapon, but now that same community had delivered the final blow. When asked for a statement, I didn't embellish anything. I repeated the same point. The truth is right here, in the footage everyone has seen. I don't need to say more, the mailbox has spoken for me. That line aired during the nightly broadcast, paired with footage of Marjorie standing beside her crumpled car, face contorted in fury. Within hours, her pushback began. I heard that Marjorie was calling several HOA board members, trying to persuade them to take her side, but no one dared. The footage was too clear, and the laughter and applause of residents captured in the clip were a verdict in themselves. She could scream that it was a setup, but the evidence was already out in the open humiliation for the world to see. That evening, a group of residents gathered in front of my house, holding up phones to rewatch footage together. They laughed, and for many, it was the first time they exhaled like a weight had finally lifted. An elderly woman said, "We've been quiet for too long. Now we don't have to be afraid anymore. Everyone's seen who she really island." That statement rang out like a final punctuation mark on Marjorie's hollow authority. As for me, I didn't need to celebrate. I just sat beside my daughter, watching her beam as she read the headlines scrolling across the screen. HOA president under fire for vandalizing residents' property. I knew, for the community, this was an irreversible unmasking. Marjorie had destroyed her own image, and now, there was no door left for her to escape through. Not long after the camera footage went viral, city police arrived in Oak Ridge. A patrol car pulled up right in front of my gate, and 2 officers stepped out, carrying a case file. They informed me that the authorities had officially opened an investigation, focusing on Marjorie's deliberate act of property damage. The news spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, residents pouring out of their homes to watch, many exchanging excited glances. Perhaps they had never truly believed this day would come, the day the self-proclaimed Queen of Oak Ridge would have to face the law. I brought them into the living room and placed the file I had prepared on the table. Photographs of every incident where the mailbox had been destroyed, detailed timestamps, and even scathing emails Marjorie had sent were included. One officer flipped through the pages, nodding slowly, then murmured, "You were more prepared than we expect." I replied calmly, "I knew the day would come when proof would matter, and I wasn't going to let her keep stomping on us." The file also contained records from HOA meetings, where Marjorie had publicly insulted and belittled me. I had kept copies just in case, and now they made a perfect addition to the case. The second officer carefully placed everything into a sealed evidence bag. As they gathered their materials, I noticed something in their eyes, not just the look of professionals doing their job, a flicker of shared conviction. By that afternoon, news of the police investigation had spread across the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered freely, speaking openly for the first time without fear. A man who had once been fined by Marjorie for hanging a flag in the wrong direction shouted, "It's about time she got a taste of what we've been dealing with." Another chimed in, "No one's above the law, not even someone who thinks they are the law." The lively conversations echoed down the street, replacing the long-standing silence with a new kind of energy. As the police departed, I stood on the porch, watching neighbors nod toward me one by one. Faces that once looked away now showed gratitude and respect. My daughter ran out, clutched my arm tightly, and asked excitedly, "Dad, are they really going to investigate her?" I smiled and replied simply, "Yes, justice has finally come knock." I knew the investigation would uncover far more than just a smashed mailbox. It would unravel years of abuse, manipulation, and unchecked authority that Marjorie had wielded over Oak Ridge. And once that door opened, there would be nowhere left for her to hide. The police hadn't even finished the initial phase of their investigation when I received a call from a local law firm. They explained that several Oak Ridge residents previously reached out to them for legal advice after being harassed by Marjorie. And now, with my story breaking wide open, they were ready to offer full support. I agreed to meet. During the meeting, I presented the full scope of events, from the photographs I had taken, the detailed notes I compiled, to the sarcastic emails Marjorie had sent, each signed with her title, OA President. The attorney, a seasoned middle-aged man, reviewed each document thoroughly, nodding as he read, cross-checking relevant legal clauses concerning property rights and the responsibilities of HOAs. He spoke with finality. "You're entirely within the law. The way you constructed your mailbox doesn't violate any building code. On the contrary, her actions clearly amount to intentional damage and abuse of power. She's completely in the wrong." That affirmation shot straight through the shadow of authority Marjorie had built for so long. A weight lifted from my chest, as if I had just cast off a stone I'd been carrying. The law wasn't on her side, it was on mine. Word spread quickly among the residents. During a casual conversation on my porch, a man who rarely spoke to me leaned in and whispered, "If even a lawyer says she's wrong, it's over. She has nothing left to stand on." That short sentence carried weight, echoing throughout the neighborhood as a new topic of conversation. As for Marjorie, the woman who once strutted down the street with pride now began to change. I saw her one late afternoon, hurriedly walking past to avoid the eyes of others. Her face had grown sallow, makeup unable to hide the hollowed eyes, and dark circles of sleepless night. There was still a forced smile on her lip, but it carried no power anymore. Some neighbors mentioned they'd seen Marjorie snapping at her own allies, shouting in private meetings as she tried to salvage her authority. But the more she yelled, the more her desperation showed. She no longer had the power to instill fear. Now, when she appeared, instead of bowed heads, people stared with thinly veiled ridicule. I walked through the neighborhood, feeling for the first time a shift in power. In the past, every time I saw Marjorie, I also saw dozens of eyes darting away. Now, She was the one avoiding eye contact, and the residents, once trembling, now stared back with quiet satisfaction. My daughter noticed the change. One evening, as we walked together, she whispered, "Dad, she looks different. I think she's scared now." I nodded, not denying it. This was no longer the woman who once screamed in my face, "I am the law here." This was someone unraveling, clawing to hold onto a power already rotting beneath her. Marjorie was still resisting, but everything had become clear. The lawyer had affirmed the truth, the police had opened a case, and the evidence was undeniable. Every step she took now was heavy, stripped of dominance. And when I looked into those exhausted eyes, I understood. Marjorie's fall had already begun, not with a dramatic blow, but with the slow, irreversible erosion brought on by a truth no one could ignore. The HOA meeting following Marjorie's accident drew a crowd far larger than usual. The hall was packed, and the faces that were once silent now burned with energy. The atmosphere was no longer sluggish, it was taut, like a wire about to snap. Everyone knew all eyes were fixed on one person, Marjorie. When the meeting began, a board member unexpectedly stood up, hand trembling but voice clear. "I've stayed silent for too long. She didn't just destroy Mr. Thornhill's mailbox. She abused her position to wrongly penalize many families. I witnessed." That statement was a spark to dry tinder. Others rose, accusing Marjorie of forcing them to replace their roofs without any actual code violations, or fining them for absurd reasons like planting the wrong type of flowers out front. The murmurs swelled into waves of noise. Marjorie remained in the chairperson's seat, her face flushed red, both hands clenched on the armrest. She tried to cut through the uproar, her voice shrill and cracking as she shouted, "I am the one who kept the standards. Without me, this place would be a zoo." But there was no authority left in that voice. It rang out sharp, desperate, and alone in a sea of people who had begun to turn their back. An older resident stood up, his voice steady and low. "You say it's about standards, but all we've seen is the imposition of contempt. We pay dues to live in peace, not to be treated like subjects." Applause erupted from many corners of the room, spreading like a wave that washed away the rain she had long enjoyed. Marjorie scanned the room, eyes wide with confusion. She looked to the faces that once formed her inner circle, but many stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. A few turned away altogether, avoiding her like someone afraid of being dragged into the quicksand now swallowing her whole. I sat in the back, watching it unfold. There was no need for me to speak. Truth was taking care of itself. Every accusation sliced through the fake veneer Marjorie had cloaked herself in. The louder she screamed, the more pathetic her HOA queen persona became. The meeting surged on with more explosive moments. A woman raised a stack of printed emails and read aloud Marjorie's orders and threat. A man recalled being fined unjustly, while Marjorie's own house failed to meet several basic codes. The room erupted in a fury that had been simmering for years. Marjorie shot to her feet, face twisted in rage, and shrieked again, "All of you will regret this. I'm the only reason Oak Ridge hasn't fallen apart." But this time, a wave of boos drowned her out. People slammed their hands on tables, others clapped in unison, and the sound became a violent storm. I saw it clearly. Marjorie's power wasn't being stripped by police or bylaws. It was disintegrating before her eyes, shattered by the very community she had long held in contempt. And when my gaze met her panicked stare, I knew this fracture could never be mended. The HOA board was no longer her fortress. It had become a mirror, reflecting her downfall in full, irreparable clarity. The uproar in the hall raged on like a storm. Marjorie screamed until her voice gave out, while the accusations kept coming without pause. I knew I couldn't remain seated any longer. I stood up, stepped into the center of the tense room, and felt dozens of eyes turned toward me. She stared at me, seething, as if she could swallow me whole, but I didn't flinch. "You're just someone who hides behind the law to trample others," I said, voice firm. The room fell instantly silent. The words echoed through the space, bouncing off every wall. Marjorie's eyes bulged, her lips quivered, but no rebuttal came. In that moment, the atmosphere was like an unofficial courtroom. Neighbors sat in rows, faces tight, eyes like judges awaiting a verdict. What I had said wasn't just a personal retort, it was an indictment, spoken on behalf of everyone. A man raised his hand and said, "We've endured enough. She's not upholding standards. She's using them to feed her contempt." A woman followed, her voice shaky but strong. "My family was humiliated for painting our door blue. That's not protecting the community. That's abuse of power." Marjorie spun around, scanning each face, her expression contorted with rage. She raised her hand, yelling, "You're all ungrateful," but no one responded. Her words dropped into the heavy silence, swallowed whole by the thick air in the room. I stepped forward, locking eyes with her stunned expression. "No one believes in the so-called standards you invented anymore. People were afraid. Fear doesn't last forever. Today, truth has spoken." I didn't shout, but each word landed like a blade, cutting through the quiet. A wave of applause rose from the back, spreading to the side. It wasn't loud but steady and deliberate, like a judge's gavel. Marjorie stepped back, her face pale, eyes scanning the room for rescue, but no one stood with her. I looked around and saw it clearly in the eyes of my neighbors' unity. This wasn't a fight over a mailbox anymore. It was a real trial, where false authority had been called to account and sentenced on the spot. And in that trial, Marjorie had made herself the defendant. I was merely the voice of truth. The room's tension began to shift into resolve. People murmured, nodded, shared looks of mutual understanding. The entire hall buzzed like a current, and I knew Marjorie's end was near. There was no throne left for her to sit on, no silence left to shield her. All that remained was the truth, and at this moment, the truth was the heaviest sentence of all. The news of the incident didn't stop at the community or the police. Not long after, the insurance company with whom Marjorie had a policy officially issued a response. A letter was sent to her house, its content brief but absolute. Claim denied due to intentional damage. That single line was enough to wipe out any last shred of hope she had. Marjorie's silver SUV sat in the garage, front crumpled, windshield shattered, frame twisted. Mechanics estimated the repair costs in the tens of thousands, a figure high enough to make even the wealthy hesitate. This time, every cent of it would fall squarely on her shoulders. No more insurance coverage to shield her, no compensation to soften the blow. The news of the insurance company turning its back spread almost as fast as the original video. Neighbors whispered to each other, and someone even read the denial letter aloud after it was leaked. She did it to herself. No one can save her this time, a resident declared loudly during a small park gathering. Laughter followed, not the nervous kind, but open, unapologetic satisfaction. Marjorie, once used to standing in an untouchable authority, was now cornered completely. She appeared less and less, face tense, each step heavier than the last. I saw her standing silently beside the wrecked vehicle, eyes swollen and red, hand gripping the denial letter. The pride she once wielded like armor had been crushed not by a distant enemy, but by her own foolish action. For the first time, the Oak Ridge community witnessed the woman who once shouted she was the law, reduced to a lone defendant. No defenders, no applause, only the cold stares of those she once trampled. And as repair bills piled up, alongside the tightening noose of legal investigations, I knew Marjorie's fall had gone beyond humiliation. It was a complete collapse. She was no longer the imposing figure, striding with chin raised and voice that drowned out entire meeting. After receiving the letter from the insurance company, she slumped on a wooden chair on her front, her back hunched as if bearing the weight of a boulder. I saw her from across the street, hands trembling, trying to clutch the paper without the strength to hold it. The familiar arrogance was gone, replaced by the slow unraveling of someone cornered. People in the neighborhood walked past her, where once their eyes dropped out of fear, now they looked directly at her, some even with mocking smiles. One person muttered, "About time." She heard it, but didn't react. She only shrank further, as if trying to vanish from everyone's sight. I sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. I remained silent, savoring the sight of justice unfolding right before my eyes. No shouting, no arguing. It was the truth itself that had taken her down, turning her self-declared power into a burden she could no longer carry. I recalled every time the mailbox was crushed, every contemptuous glance she threw at me, every meeting where I became the punchline. All of it had been answered, not with fists or blind revenge, but with a collapse so absolute, so undeniable, that no one could dispute it. My daughter sat beside me, gently leaning her head on my shoulder. She looked across the street, toward Marjorie's porch, where the woman now trembled, then whispered, "Dad, she looks like a different person." I nodded slightly, and replied, "That's what happens when truth tears off the mask." She said nothing more, but the faint smile on her lips told me she understood exactly what was happening. In the days that followed, Marjorie's unraveling became the talk of the neighborhood. People no longer spoke of her with fear, but with unrestrained satisfaction. They mentioned the massive repair bill she had to shoulder, the widening investigation, and the allies who had since abandoned her. To the residents of Oak Ridge, the image of her clutching the insurance denial letter, trembling, had become the very symbol of long-awaited justice. I noticed, for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt different. Laughter rang out more often. Children played freely without being barked at, and adults chatted openly in their yard, without fear of scrutiny. Everything Marjorie had built, fear, pressure, submission, was gradually dissolving, replaced by a renewed belief that anyone who puts themselves above others will eventually pay the price. One evening, I stood on the porch, looking across at Marjorie's darkened house. No more parties, no more blazing lights whenever she wanted to show off. Only pitch-black windows remained, the mood of the woman who had once been the neighborhood's nightmare. I let out a quiet sigh, not out of pity, but because I recognized that the wheel of justice often turns slowly, yet once it turns, no one escapes it. The next morning, while walking my daughter to school, I overheard a few neighbors talking. "That's way too light for her," one said. "Crushed us for years. Losing a car is barely a scratch." Another replied, "At least now she knows what it feels like to be left behind. That's punishment enough." I didn't join in, just kept walking, though I quietly wondered if this fall was truly enough, because I knew this truth was only the beginning. What Marjorie had done went far beyond the mailbox. It was an entire pattern of abuse and overreach. And as the police continued their investigation, the rest of her wrongdoing would surface, heavier than a wrecked car or a denied claim. In the days following Marjorie's downfall, the Oak Ridge community seemed to awaken. People no longer avoided mentioning her name. On the contrary, they were eager to unearth the past. Stories long buried were dragged into the light. An elderly man who had lived here nearly 2 decades recalled how a black family once had to leave after a series of warnings from Marjorie. She fined them for having a porch painted too dark, for leaving a truck parked overnight, and relentlessly piled on penalties until they were forced to sell the house at a loss. A young mother also spoke up, saying that when she first moved in, Marjorie had cornered her in the driveway, pointed at her child playing with a ball, and said, "Kids like that are going to drag down property value." That story spread quickly, sending a chill through the neighborhood. It turned out that the insults she hurled at me weren't an exception, they were a pattern, repeated year after year. Then one day, a blow hit harder than any before. A resident working in tech accidentally revealed a trove of internal emails leaked from the HOA's server. In them, Marjorie's chilling words were laid bare. She wrote to a colleague, "We need to reduce the number of families who don't fit the standard. They only drag down Oak Ridge's image." Another email was even more blatant. "If we apply enough pressure, they'll sell cheap. That's how we keep Oak Ridge pure." Those words spread like wildfire, not just within the neighborhood, far beyond. On social media, thousands reacted with outrage. Hashtags emerged, tying Marjorie's name to discrimination and abuse of power. People stopped talking about the wrecked SUV and began speaking about an entire system she had turned into a tool of oppression. In the neighborhood, fury erupted. Residents who had long stayed silent began sharing their experiences. Everyone seemed to have a bitter memory of Marjorie being fined for planting the wrong flowers, being shamed in the HOA newsletter, even being threatened with water shutoff for not complying with absurd rules. All those fragments came together to form a dark portrait of the authority she once wielded. I stood in the middle of that torrent of information, silently watching. The justice I had waited for wasn't just a totaled vehicle or a denied insurance claim, it was the truth, exposed down to its roots. And now, that truth was undeniable. Marjorie had no place left to hide, and no excuse mattered when her own words were doing the accusing. My daughter read the headlines as they spread online, then looked up and asked, "Dad, do you think everyone's seen it now?" I answered, "Yes, they've all seen it. And this time, no one can look away." She smiled, a quiet smile of relief after so many days of fear. Marjorie, once perched high above, had now become a pariah in the eyes of the very community she once ruled. And I knew this was only the beginning of the harsher judgments still to come. Ever since the blatantly discriminatory emails were exposed, the reputation of the HOA in Oak Ridge has collapsed almost instantly. Once, people mentioned the board with a sense of caution, seeing it as the authority that enforced strict rules regulating every blade of grass, every coat of paint. Now, no one regards those standards as legitimate. Residents speak freely in the streets, and even families who once supported Marjorie have quietly withdrawn, pretending they were never on her side. HOA meetings have become a farce, no longer a platform for showcasing power, but a space for residents to voice grievances and call out injustice. Marjorie became the focal point of resentment. Whenever she stepped out of her house, cold stares followed her. There was no fear left in those eyes, only contempt and satisfaction. A man she had once unjustly fined confronted her on the street. "You thought you were the law, but now you're living proof of corruption." Remarks like that came at her from all sides, each one sharpening the clarity of her downfall. On social media, the backlash exploded with even greater force. Thousands of people, including residents from other states, shared the emails and dubbed Marjorie the face of discrimination and abuse of power. Her name surfaced across countless community forums, accompanied by similar stories from other neighborhoods. People began to see Oak Ridge as merely a text case, and Marjorie as a symbol of the twisted authority that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. Within the neighborhood, each passing day brought new signs of her decline. Children, once forced to play quietly in their yards, now laughed and ran freely within her view, an innocent form of defiance. Adults held small gatherings on their lawns, something Marjorie had once banned under the pretense of protecting the neighborhood's image. They did it openly, deliberately, making sure she would see. I saw Marjorie walk by several times, her face gaunt, her eyes sunken, her steps hurried. She still wore her familiar light-colored suit, but it no longer conveyed authority. It only exposed the pretense like a cracked mask she refused to take off. Whispers clung to her heels. "She's the one who forced people to sell their home. She's why this place felt suffocating for years." One day, my daughter saw her from a distance and whispered, "Dad, why does she look like no one stands with her anymore?" I looked and nodded. That's exactly it. The community had turned its back. The same people who once laughed with her at meetings, who applauded when she humiliated me, were now silent, pretending not to know her. Her isolation was the cruelest sentence, one that dragged on day by day, drowning her in disgrace that no defense could undo. The HOA's reputation crumbled, not because its rules or regulations vanished, but because people saw them for what they were, tools in the hands of someone who abused power. When the mask fell, the whole system shook. And Marjorie, once the embodiment of control, became a name synonymous with revulsion both inside Oak Ridge and far beyond. In the quiet nights, as I looked from my porch toward her mansion, I could feel the reversal in full. A place that once echoed with smug laughter, now sat in darkness. False power doesn't need hammers or axes to be destroyed, it only needs the truth. And the truth had turned Marjorie into someone rejected by the entire community, a solitary figure in a neighborhood she once believed belonged solely to her. On the day of the special HOA meeting, the hall was packed so tightly that many had to stand along the hallway. The atmosphere was nothing like before, no indifference, no avoidance, only a restless energy filled with anticipation. News of the discriminatory emails, the viral clips, and the incident involving Marjorie's silver SUV had, for the first time, united the entire Oak Ridge community. On many faces was a look of resolve, and in their hands, they gripped white slips of paper, ready for a vote of no confidence. Marjorie walked in, her expression forced, eyes red, and ringed from lack of sleep. She still wore her usual light-colored suit, but it no longer looked dignified. All eyes turned toward her, cold and contemptuous. She sat at the chairperson's seat, cleared her throat in an attempt to remain composed, but the murmurs across the room drowned out her voice. The moment the meeting coordinator began to speak, a resident stood up abruptly and called out, "We no longer trust her. We want to vote on the no-confidence motion today." Applause broke out in wave, unstoppable and thunderous. Marjorie turned pale, lunged toward the microphone, and screamed, "This is a conspiracy. You've all been manipulated." But no one was listening anymore. I stood from my seat in the middle of the room. All eyes turned to me. I took a deep breath and spoke, not with trembling but with clarity, every word echoing through the hall. "I've endured enough. Every time my mailbox was destroyed, every time a car rammed into my property, every insult hurled at me during meeting. It's all documented. I stayed silent, and she took that silence as submission. And it wasn't just me, many families here have suffered the same." I presented the folder of photographs and records I had prepared, and laid it on the table. The coordinator threw it, projecting each page onto the large screen in the hall. Images of the mangled mailbox, crumpled silver SUV, and the discriminatory emails appeared before everyone. The room buzzed with outrage. One voice said aloud, "We've been oppressed far too long." Marjorie thrashed and shouted into the mic, "I did all of this to preserve standards. I'm the only one who ever protected Oak Ridge." But her words held no weight anymore. An elderly resident responded flatly, "No, you were only protecting your own ego." Applause thundered, drowning her voice completely. I looked around and saw faces once fearful, now filled with strength. A woman clutched her ballot tightly, eyes blazing. A young man raised his phone, live streaming the entire meeting. Hundreds were watching outside the room. The hall had transformed into a public courtroom, and Marjorie now stood at an invisible defendant's bench. When the coordinator called for the vote, the entire hall rose as one, hands lifting ballots high. The unity took my breath away, because it wasn't just a vote against one woman, it was a declaration that justice had returned to Oak Ridge. I sat down, my daughter's hand resting on mine, her eyes glowing with pride, and I knew this moment would be remembered as the day the whole community dared to rise. When the coordinator announced the vote was about to begin, the entire hall fell silent for a few seconds, as if preserving the solemnity of this decisive moment. Ballots were distributed quickly, each person holding theirs without hesitation. They had waited for this moment for years, and now, it had arrived. I looked around and saw faces lit with determination, eyes gleaming as if the invisible chains Marjorie had bound them with were finally being cast off. When the command to "begin" rang out, the residents' arms rose in unison. A sea of white paper lit up the hall, covering every row. The number of votes against Marjorie was so overwhelming that it needed no careful counting. A glance made the outcome clear. The coordinator, voice trembling with emotion, declared, "The majority votes for removal." At that moment, the hall erupted in thunderous applause. Clapping roared like a war drum, strong and relentless, signaling the end of a dark reign. Some stood up and shouted with joy, others cried from relief, and hands that once hung low now slammed together like gavels delivering justice. I felt the ground tremble beneath me, every applause a declaration that Oak Ridge had changed. Marjorie sat frozen in the chairperson's seat, face pale, eyes vacant. The screams she once hurled across meetings now echoed only as fading shadows. There were no more nods, no more supportive clap. Everyone had turned their back, collectively rejecting her presence in the council. An elderly resident, once always silent, stepped up to the podium for the first time, his voice shaky yet firm. "We let fear rule us for too long. Today, we choose the truth." Another wave of applause surged through the hall, crashing into every wall, cracking open the false shell of power Marjorie had clung to. I sat still, observing. The rage that once burned in me had faded, replaced by a deep sense of relief. I remembered my daughter's eyes when she once asked if I would let them keep humiliating us. Now, I could answer, no. And not just me, an entire community had chosen to stand tall. Outside the hall, as the meeting adjourned, people gathered in small groups, chatting animatedly. Smiles appeared more freely, and conversations flowed without fear of, what if Marjorie hears? Children ran across the courtyard, laughing under the late afternoon sun, as if ushering in a new era for Oakridge. As for Marjorie, she left the hall in silence, with no entourage, no glances of respect. Her steps faltered, her appearance noticeably withered. The applause and cheers behind her were not just expressions of satisfaction, they were the final verdict, etched into the memory of all who witnessed it. In that moment, I understood that justice doesn't always come from a court or the police. Sometimes, it comes from the applause of a community brave enough to rise together. And Oakridge, after years of repression, had written its own verdict for the one who once believed herself untouchable. The vote of removal was officially announced on a mild, sunny morning. The news spread through a brief but weighty email sent to every resident of Oakridge. Marjorie, who had held the position of HOA chair for years, was now formally stripped of her title. There were no banners, no fanfare, no public celebrations, yet in the hearts of every resident, this was a true victory, a triumph without flowers or flags, but enough to lift the weight that had pressed down on them for so many years. Within hours, the entire neighborhood seemed to awaken from a long slumber. Quiet conversations began to ripple along sidewalks, in cafes, and at the small park down the road. The usual cautious silence was gone, replaced by deep sighs of relief, firm handshakes, and knowing glances filled with both empathy and quiet satisfaction. Everyone understood that an era had ended, an era where power had been wielded like a cudgel to control, to threaten, and to force people to bow their head. Marjorie, the woman who once declared herself the law here, was now pushed to the margins of the very community she once manipulated. She no longer sat in the chairperson's seat with a microphone and a rulebook. No more issuing commands, no more imposing mandates, no more breath-holding over whether someone would be fined for a misaligned lawn or an unacceptable shade of. The morning after the removal, she appeared as usual, stepping out of her familiar mansion. But everything had changed. No one avoided her gaze like before. Instead, people looked her straight in the eye, cold and indifferent, sometimes with a hint of quiet contempt. A few even allowed themselves a tight-lipped smile, not from glee, but from the quiet vindication of having reclaimed something that was always theirs. All the layers of power Marjorie had once wrapped herself in her demeanor, her voice, polished exterior were now stripped away. The aura was gone. What remained was a solitary, diminished woman in the very place she once ruled. The silver SUV, her old tool of intimidation, still sat silently in the garage. The front was crumpled, the grille shattered, a lingering mark of a collision that everyone knew all too well. Insurance had refused to cover the damages, citing intentional misconduct outside their liability. The repair cost totaled tens of thousands of dollars, a burden no one could lift for her. Some said she'd taken the car to 3 or 4 different body shops, but every quote came back high. Each time she left, she walked out with her head down, as though fate itself grinding her into the ground. Debt began to close in. The HOA fees she once exempted herself from were now being retroactively charged in full. Lawsuits, legal fees, and outstanding payments piled up relentlessly. People started noticing her quietly selling off items that once symbolized her pride: a luxury Swiss watch, a rare wine collection, imported designer furniture, but all of it barely made a dent. It was like tossing salt into the sea. Even those who once surrounded Marjorie began to turn their back. The allies who clapped in approval at HOA meetings, the ones who defended her every unreasonable decision, have now vanished. No more dinner invitations, no more casual calls, no one left by her side. Marjorie began to realize, all these years, she hadn't had friends, only opportunists. I sat on my porch, as usual, watching her walk quietly down a street that had come back to life. Her posture was heavy, stripped of pride. The light-colored suit that once symbolized her professionalism now hung awkwardly on her frame. Her carefully styled hair looked brittle and frayed. Her face was marked by deep lines and dark circles beneath her eyes. My daughter saw the scene and asked, "Dad, can she still make life hard for people?" I looked at her. Her eyes showed no fear, only curiosity. I shook my head and replied calmly, "No, things have changed." And I knew she understood. Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes, all it takes is a community willing to say, enough. Embarrassed, Marjorie had lost her position, wrecked her car, drowned in debt, and been abandoned by those she once counted on. Her downfall wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was absolute. One by one, everything collapsed, each layer peeled away, and nothing could stop it. The bitterest truth of all was that everything she once believed to be her strength, power, wealth, influence, had become the very things dragging her deeper down. One late afternoon, I was taking out the trash when I saw Marjorie standing frozen beside her crumpled silver SUV. Her face was gaunt, pale, eyes bloodshot. Her hand clutched the car door as if clinging to the last remnants of lost power. Suddenly, she looked up and screamed at me. "This is all your fault!" Her voice was hoarse, cracked, echoing down the empty street. That sentence, once her weapon of intimidation, was now just the cry of someone cornered. She shouted it again, louder each time, as if trying to convince the world she was the victim. But I knew no one believed that anymore. People passing by heard her, but no one responded. They simply looked, quietly turned away. I didn't look away. I remembered everything. The times she humiliated me in the meeting hall, the way her car crashed crushed my mailbox like it was a game. But now, she was the one trembling. I stepped forward and spoke, my voice low but firm. Number, you reap what you sow. The words fell like a cold verdict, not from a judge, but from someone who had once suffered in silence. Marjorie froze. Her mouth opened to protest, but no sound came. Her hand slipped from the car door, and her body swayed. A few residents stood at a distance, witnesses by chance. No one intervened, but everyone understood. One man murmured, "That's right, she brought this on herself." Another nodded, then turned away as if the final page of a heavy book had just been turned. Marjorie made one last attempt to reclaim her grip. "If it weren't for you, I'd still be the law here. Oakridge still listened to me." I met her eyes and said, "Oakridge doesn't need someone who twists the truth through rules. The law doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to justice. And justice, you destroyed it yourself." I didn't say anything more. I turned and walked back toward the porch. My daughter was there, waiting. She didn't ask anything, just looked at me with relief in her eyes. I gave her a slight nod, as if to promise her. The darkness passed. Behind me, Marjorie's shouting faded. No one listened anymore. No one wanted to. Silence returned, but it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a chapter closing. I understood then. Collapse doesn't always come with hammers or knives. Sometimes, all it takes is one sentence at the right moment, like a mirror held up to the truth, to bring an entire era to an end. And for Marjorie, that mirror had no way back. That morning, the neighborhood buzzed again as a police cruiser pulled up in front of Marjorie's house. Two officers stepped out, one holding a thick envelope stamped with a red seal. They knocked several times before Marjorie finally appeared. When the door swung open, everyone nearby could see it clearly. She no longer carried the imposing presence that once made Oakridge residents tread lightly. The familiar light-colored suit was now wrinkled, the hem crumpled as if thrown on in a hurry. Her hair was disheveled, no longer sleek, and her face bore the deep lines of sleepless nights and anxiety. One officer read the court summons aloud, his voice even and steady, each word echoing through the still air. "Marjorie Lexton is hereby summoned for charges of willful property damage, harassment, and abuse of authority within the council." He handed her the summons. Marjorie reached out with trembling hands, her lips moving but unable to form a single word. Neighbors stood just a few steps away, their eyes watching with not a trace of sympathy. A woman whispered, "It's time she faced real justice." The man beside her nodded, voice firm. "This is the ending we deserve after all those years of being pushed down." Their quiet remarks were just loud enough for Marjorie to hear, and they made her shoulders shrink, face grow even paler. I stood on my porch, watching the scene like a play reaching its final act. Every detail revealed her unraveling. The wrinkled suit, the tangled hair, the vacant eye. It was a sharp contrast to the image she once projected, striding confidently in the sun, chin held high, sneering at everyone she passed. Marjorie tried to cling to the last shred of pride, lifting her chin to shout, voice trembling, "All of you will regret this. I was the only one keeping Oakridge upright." But no one replied. The street remained silent, the only sound the soft rustle of the summons in her hand. And in that silence, her scream dropped like a stone, vanishing without a trace. I stepped off the porch, walked past her, and our eyes met hers, red and glassy. There was no more anger, no more hatred in me. I simply said, "No one regrets anything except you." Marjorie froze, her lips quivering, then lowered her head, gripping the summons so tightly it crumpled in her hand. As the police car drove away, taking the weight of the moment with it, the Oakridge community remained standing, watching. No one cheered, no one mocked. They stayed quiet, letting the image of Marjorie clutching the court summons imprint itself on memory, a bitter curtain call, needing no further commentary. That evening, my daughter sat beside me and softly asked, "Dad, she really lost this time, didn't she?" I nodded and answered, "Yeah, this time, there's no way back." In her eyes, I saw the relief, like the fear that had lived with us for so long had finally, truly ended. Marjorie once believed herself untouchable, but now, before the eyes of everyone, all she had left was a wrinkled suit, disheveled hair, and a court summons that served as the period at the end of her arrogant reign. After the police car pulled away, the street slowly quieted, though a heavy echo lingered in the air. I stood alone at the gate, eyes fixed on the steel mailbox. The fading sunlight struck its surface, casting cold glints of light, resolute and unyielding like a block of immortal metal. It was no longer just a common object for receiving letters. It had become Oakridge's symbol of justice, a silent witness to everything this community had just endured. I stepped closer, gently resting my hand on the solid post. Memories surged of the first time it was dented, of the day it was crushed to bits, of the meetings where I was humiliated, of my daughter's eyes watching her father turned into a laughingstock. All of it seemed forged into a single form, standing firm outside my home, a reminder that truth can be buried temporarily, but never erased. Marjorie drove straight into that mailbox, and from that moment moment on, there was no turning back. It became the marker of reversal, from one man's shame to a community's vindication, from a symbol of oppression to a symbol of defiance. I looked at it and couldn't stop myself from thinking, she deserved it. Because justice doesn't always arrive with fanfare or spectacle. Sometimes, it arrives simply through the natural consequences of one's action. Marjorie thought she could wield the rule, that the silence of residents proved her absolute power. But it was her arrogance that brought her down. I didn't need to strike back. I only needed to build a mailbox strong enough. And she, in all her pride, ran straight into it, as if delivering her own sentence. In the days that followed, Oak Ridge residents often stopped as they passed, pausing to look at the steel mailbox like a small monument. Some smiled soft, others muttered, "That's justice right there." Children ran around, pointing at it, whispering the story they had just witnessed. To this community, the mailbox wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to all of us, living proof that unity and truth can topple even the most arrogant. I sat on the porch, glancing from Marjorie's dark, lifeless mansion to the unwavering mailbox. The space between them was the distance between two worlds. On one side, a bitter collapse. On the other, a newfound belief rebuilt. My daughter sat beside me and whispered, "Dad, maybe no one will be afraid anymore." I smiled and nodded. Yes, fear had died the moment that silver SUV crumpled beneath the steel post. Justice doesn't need promises. It only needs a moment to reveal itself. And I knew that moment had arrived right here in Oak, witnessed by all. The steel mailbox began returning to its original purpose, receiving mail. But it was that very normalcy that made it more remarkable than ever. No longer was it an object to be vandalized and quietly replaced. No longer a vulnerability of a family that had long kept its head down. Now, it stood there, calmly in the heart of the neighborhood, a living testament to what had happened and what would never happen again. People started giving it names that were both teasing and celebratory. The Wall of Justice, the indestructible mailbox, and one child even burst out laughing and called it the Hammer of Truth. At first, I took those names as jokes, a way for the community to soothe itself after the storm. But slowly, I realized they spoke with genuine respect, not because the mailbox was made of steel, but because of what it had come to represent, the courage to say no at exactly the right time. That mailbox didn't just survive, it became a symbol of resistance, of the bravery to speak out, and above all, a symbol of hope. It reminded everyone that a community doesn't need grand weapons or blaring slogans to dismantle tyranny. Sometimes, all it takes is one undeniable proof of truth, and that's enough. People passing by would often pause for a few seconds. Some would gently touch the cold steel, then smile. A simple gesture, but one that held recognition and a quiet pride. One day, I went out to collect the mail and found an envelope with no name, no recipient listed. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you. Oak Ridge finally has a symbol of standing up." The writer was an old man I rarely saw, who lived at the far end of the street. But that letter, to me, was more valuable than any award. Children gathered around the mailbox as if it were a historical landmark. They passed around little stories they called The Legend of Marjorie's Defeat. One of them even framed a messy drawing of the crumpled SUV beside the sturdy mailbox and handed it to me like a trophy. And with every laugh, every new story told, felt like the shadow that had hovered over Oak Ridge for so many years was lifting, a little more each time. Oak Ridge changed by the day, and that change wasn't subtle. Things that had once been impossible were now ordinary, even welcomed. People no longer whispered in fear when they wanted to be different. They began offering honest suggestions, sharing ideas, and trying new things. One resident proposed planting flowers outside the traditional standards that the HOA used to enforce. In the past, he would have been met with cold refusal, perhaps even forced compliance. But this time, he received praise from the board and the neighbors alike. Another family decided to paint their front door a deep shade of blue, the very color Marjorie once labeled unsuitable for the community landscape. Before, they would have certainly been fined, but now, the entire neighborhood smiled, came over to congratulate them, and some even asked for the paint brand so they could do the same. What was once labeled against the rule had become a clear expression of freedom, and I knew Oak Ridge was healing itself through these very changes. Even HOA meetings, once a one-sided monologue, had truly become forums in the real sense. People didn't just show up for attendance, they engaged. There were debates, disagreements, and even heated moments. But everything took place with equality. No one imposed anything anymore. In a private conversation, the new coordinator shared with me, ever since she lost her position, we've realized how powerful a collective voice can be. And now, no one wants to go back to the way things were. My daughter grew up in the midst of all these changes. She ran and played with her friends along a street that used to be silent and somber. She told me that at school, classmates had begun to hear their parents mention the steel mailbox as an inspiring story. One kid even bragged, "My family lives in Oak Ridge too," as if that was a badge of pride. I watched my daughter, her eyes lighting up every time she told a story, and I knew that this memory, the memory of a time when people were once silent, then learned to stand would stay with her for life. She won't grow up in fear, won't learn to avoid or stay silent in the face of injustice. She had seen with her own eyes what happens when a community chooses not to bow its head anymore. And that, I knew, would become the foundation of who she would be. To me, the steel mailbox isn't just a symbol. It's proof that an ordinary person, without power or title, if willing to refuse silence, can change an entire community. Oak Ridge isn't the same. It's no longer a place of downcast eyes, no longer a place where people stay quiet just to keep the peace. It has become a place where people dare to speak truth, dare to be different, and dare to defend what is right. Every morning, when I step out onto the porch, first sunlight hits the surface of the mailbox, making it gleam like it's been gilded. That light reflects onto the porch, onto the curtains in the windows, onto the faces of those walking by. It feels like a quiet reminder. We've turned a page. And that new chapter, I believe with certainty, will have no room for oppression. I used to think changing a community was something too distant, something meant for politicians, large organizations, or people with influence. But now I understand. It all begins with something small, a single act of courage, a refusal to bow down, or even a mailbox built from steel. That steel mailbox now accepts more than letters it trusts. The trust that injustice is not permanent, that if one person speaks up, then two, then an entire community rises. No oppressor, no matter how powerful, can stand. And if someone were to ask me, where did the change in Oak Ridge begin? I would point without hesitation to the end of the street. There, nestled between the trees and the clean sidewalk, a steel mailbox still stands in silence. It makes no sound, yet everyone hears its voice, clear, resolute, and undeniable. One afternoon, as golden sunlight poured over the streets of Oak Ridge, newly reborn after days of storms, I sat with my daughter on the front porch step. The rain had stopped a few days earlier, yet a lingering dampness and gloom still seemed to cling to the corners of the neighborhood. Small puddles dotted the roadside, reflecting the sun like scattered shards of broken glass, as if the street had just weathered a silent war. My daughter rested her head on my shoulder, her eyes fixed on the steel mailbox still standing motionless at the gate. Its exterior remained steady, cold, and somehow defiant, as if declaring, I won't fall, no matter who tries to break. To me, it was just a mailbox. But in her mind, and perhaps in the minds of everyone in this neighborhood, it had become something far more, a marker of something greater, a symbol of justice, of speaking out, of the choice not to be trampled. I turned to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. My heart was heavy, but my voice held firm. You must remember this. No one has the right to step on others just because of their skin color or money. No matter how much power they hold, the truth will always be stronger. I didn't speak loudly, just enough for the two of us to hear, but each word seemed to carve itself into the air, into the twilight settling over Oak Ridge. It wasn't just a lesson for her, it was a vow I was quietly renewing to myself. She looked up at me, her eyes clear but holding something deeper, as if trying to absorb the weight of every word. She asked, Dad, do you think there will be anyone like her again? Her voice carried no anger, curiosity laced with a trace of worry. I sighed, hesitated for a moment, then replied, maybe, somewhere. Maybe not exactly like her, but injustice doesn't disappear just because we want it to. What matters is that you know how to stand tall, that you speak out when you see something wrong. Silence only makes the wrong grow stronger. You've seen it, our neighborhood stayed silent too long, and we paid the price for that silence. Paused, gently squeezing her shoulder. But when everyone speaks up together, no one can place themselves above the law. She didn't respond, just nodded softly, then turned her gaze back to the mailbox. Her face relaxed, her lips curved into a small smile, one full of pride. That smile warmed my heart. I knew that, deep within her young spirit, a seed of courage had begun to take root. And maybe one day, when she's faced with injustice in her own life, she'll remember this moment, the evening with her father, sunlight gilding her hair, and the steel mailbox standing tall at the end of the street, and she won't bow her head. I let my daughter sit quietly in my arms as I turned my gaze toward the familiar houses lining our street. I used to believe that patience would preserve peace for my family, that it was best not to provoke, not to confront. But in the end, that very patience made us a target easy to trample on, easy to take advantage of. Now I know the greatest lesson isn't about fighting back with force or revenge, it's about having the courage to say no the first time injustice shows up. She sat in silence for a moment, then suddenly wrapped her arms around me from behind. Her voice whispered, I'm proud of you, Dad. I didn't say anything, I just smiled gently and placed my hand over her. In that moment, every exhaustion, every burden from the past months seemed to dissolve. The mailbox outside still gleamed under the last rays of sunset. It stood as a constant reminder. Justice isn't some distant, abstract thing tucked behind courthouse doors or buried in 100-page ruling. It starts with the smallest act, the seemingly trivial decision decisions like building a mailbox out of steel and resolving. And that lesson, I've managed to pass on to my daughter. I believe she'll carry it with her for the rest of her life. As night fell and my daughter went off to her room, I remained on the porch. The quiet was no longer heavy or hollow like before. There were no more wary glances, no more stifling silence every time Marjorie walked by. Now, distant sounds floated in the murmur of conversation, children giggling, the soft whir of bike tires on pavement, all rewriting what it meant to be alive in Oakridge. I sat there for a long time, leaning back in my chair, eyes fixed on the mailbox. It wasn't just an object anymore, it was part of a memory, part of a story. I remembered the early days, how every time the mailbox was smashed, I rebuilt it. Not out of stubbornness, but out of belief. If I gave in, it would never end. And when I poured all my resolve into building one out of steel, something no SUV could crush, it stopped being a personal act. It became a declaration. If I had kept silent, kept replacing fragile mailboxes for her to destroy, Marjorie's contempt would have continued unchecked. She would have kept mistaking patience for weakness, kept wielding her power to spread fear across our community. But when I stood up, not with fists, but with resolve, everything began to shift. First, all I wanted was to protect my family, but it became something more, a signal that woke the entire neighborhood from its slumber of fear. I remember exactly the moment my daughter saw the crumpled silver SUV while the steel mailbox stood tall. In her eyes, I was no longer the father who always stayed quiet, always avoided conflict. I had become the father who defended what was right. And I realized, sometimes, all it takes is one small act done at the right moment, in the right way, to change how a child sees their parent and how they see the world. The next morning, as I walked through the neighborhood, I met many neighbors. Some shook my hand, some simply nodded, and others said nothing at all, but their eyes spoke volume. Everyone understood that this change began with a small act, a mailbox that stood firm. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always arrive through the court. Sometimes, it starts at the front gate, born from the courage of an ordinary person. Someone once said to me, "It all started with that mailbox." I didn't deny it. It's true. A steel box, cold and silent, yet when built with resolve, it became a flame that warmed the hearts of an entire community. That evening, my daughter came back out to the porch, a cup of warm milk in hand. She sat beside me, legs swinging, eyes fixed on the mailbox. "Dad," she said softly, "I think justice is like that box. Everyone can see it, can't deny it." I smiled, gently ruffling her hair. "You're right," I said. "Sometimes justice begins with a mailbox." And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of peace. No need for praise, no need for applause. I knew I had done the right thing, not just for myself, but for the community, for the next generation. Each morning, when the first sunlight hits the mailbox, making it gleam like a small mirror reflecting the will of an entire neighborhood, I quietly remind myself, justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs someone willing to stand and hold their ground. And here in Oakridge, we had that sparked by a mailbox that seemed small, but was strong enough to shake an entire arrogant reign. I believe this story will spread not just through this small neighborhood, but to any place still shadowed by injustice. And if anyone ever asks, where does justice begin? I'll point to the end of the street, where that steel mailbox still stands, unshaken by it all. I stood before the steel mailbox, letting my hand glide across its cold, rigid surface. It caught the gentle light of a new morning, standing tall as if it had never been crushed, never been the target of so many insults. As I looked at it, the entire journey came flooding back, from the days filled with fury, humiliation, and repressed outrage, to the moment Marjorie's silver SUV crumpled on impact and the entire community erupted in satisfied applause. It all played out vividly in my mind, like a film in which I had been the living witness. There were nights I had sat on the porch, fists clenched until my knuckles turned white, wondering whether to keep enduring or to fight back. There were meetings where I bit my tongue as Marjorie spat her disdain in front of the crowd. And there were moments I nearly gave up, believing one person couldn't possibly stand against a whole corrupt system. But in the end, a steel mailbox became the answer. Now, looking back, I no longer feel the rage that once consumed me. Instead, I feel peace because I restored justice in a way no one expected. I didn't need to shout to prove my point, and I didn't need fists to bring someone down. I only needed to let the truth stand in plain sight, and that truth changed an entire community. Marjorie is now just a shadow in the path. The woman who once made families tremble is now a name tied to downfall. No one looks at her with fear anymore, only with contempt and a touch of pity. Her story is retold as a cautionary tale. That false power, fed by silence and fear, always collapses when the truth is finally laid bare. Oakridge has changed. Laughter echoes down the street. Community meetings are now places of shared discussion, not one-sided decrees. Children play freely, and adults speak up with confidence. No one fears being punished by absurd rules anymore. And in that transformation, I clearly see the value of refusing to stay silent. My daughter ran out, wrapped her arms around mine, her eyes lighting up as she looked at the steel mailbox. "Dad, we won," she whispered. I nodded, quiet warmth rising in my chest. Yes, We won, but not just for ourselves. For an entire community that had once been stifled. I turned back to the mailbox one more time. It would remain there, a constant reminder that justice can begin with even the smallest act as long as someone dares to stand up. And I knew that from this day on, Oak Ridge would never let another Marjorie rise again. As this journey comes to a close, I feel as light as the wind. Marjorie is in the past, and Oak Ridge has stepped into a new chapter. And I, a man once humiliated by a shattered mailbox, can now smile as I watch it gleam in the morning light. I still remember the moment I told my daughter, "Justice isn't far away. It begins when we refuse to bow our heads." That line wasn't just for her. It was a reminder I needed for myself after everything. All those years living in Oak Ridge, I had seen families pushed to the brink by Marjorie's arrogance. People stayed silent to avoid trouble, thinking one lone voice couldn't change anything. But that silence became the darkness that allowed someone like her to thrive. I was one of them, until the day I decided not to stay quiet any longer. Standing before the steel mailbox, I realized this journey was never just a personal battle. It stood as proof of something simple. When one person dares to stand tall, others find courage in that defiance. If I had kept silent, Marjorie would still be the law in Oak Ridge. But when I chose to face her, the community slowly found its voice. Justice, it turns out, doesn't start in some distant courtroom. It begins the moment an ordinary person chooses to hold their ground. I smiled and quietly said, "This isn't just my victory, it's for everyone who's ever been oppressed." That smile wasn't pride, it was a release, because, finally, people had true freedom in their own home. I knew that many residents who once endured Marjorie's humiliation would sleep easier now, no longer fearing some absurd fine. Children would play freely without being scolded, and adults would speak up when something felt wrong. And none of that was a victory for one person, it was a victory for all. Lately, I've often seen small groups gathering on the street, talking about ways to improve the neighborhood. Some suggest building a new playground for the kid, while others talk about redecorating the entrance to the community. What makes me happiest isn't the plans themselves, it's how they're discussed. Equally, openly, without fear. It all comes from the lesson we've just lived through. My daughter often sits quietly, looking at the mailbox, then breaks into a smile. She may not fully grasp the meaning of justice yet, but she knows her father stood up for her and for this neighborhood, and I believe, when she grows up, this memory will teach her that no one has the right to trample others, and that silence only feeds injustice. Marjorie is now just a shadow in a story told as a warning. The community doesn't need to mention her much anymore, because the truth is already clear. All they need to remember is that one day, Oak Ridge bowed its head then, through resistance, learned to lift it again. And from that moment on, no one wanted to return to silence. I took a deep breath, feeling the scent of morning fill my chest. Justice isn't something lofty, it begins the moment we decide not to bow our head. And now I can smile, because I've proven that not just to myself, to everyone who's ever been oppressed. I stood before the steel mailbox, letting the morning breeze pass through, carrying the crisp chill of a day just beginning. That steel post still gleamed, steady as the day I built it, but now it was no longer just a tool for receiving letters. It was a symbol, a witness to a confrontation that transformed an entire community. Looking at it, I saw the full journey I had taken, from the day's choked humiliation, to the moment the neighborhood rose together, and now to the calm freedom that followed the storm. When I first moved to Oak Ridge, all I wanted was a peaceful place to raise my daughter. But that peace quickly vanished under the grip of Marjorie, the woman who appointed herself the law of the neighborhood. She wielded her HOA power to impose absurd standards, used her condescending glare to spread fear, and turned her silver SUV into a weapon that crushed people's dignity. I once chose silence, hoping it would all pass, but silence only fed her arrogance. That was the mistake I had to face, and the first lesson I learned: staying silent in the face of injustice only helps it take deeper root. My act of defiance started with a simple decision to build a mailbox sturdy enough that she couldn't destroy it again. But behind that decision was a quiet eruption. I poured everything I remembered from my time as a military engineer, those days designing defense structures, into crafting a weapon of steel and concrete, not to attack anyone, but to protect the truth, to send a message that I was no longer a shadow to be stepped on. And when Marjorie slammed into that mailbox, making herself the loser right there in the street, I realized that justice doesn't always need grand forums, it just needs one moment strong enough to make the oppressor collapse. That moment wasn't just mine. All of Oak Ridge rushed out, and for the first time, their eyes held no fear. They filmed it, they laughed, they shared that moment on social media, and thousands more outside our street watched the downfall of a tyrant's symbol. Marjorie didn't just lose to me, she lost to the very community she had suppressed. And when the applause broke out, I knew this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a release for everyone who had ever lived in silence. After that, truth was stripped bare, fast, and unforgiving. Internal emails exposed a mindset of discrimination, accusations poured in from residents, the insurance company's refusal to compensate, all of it came together like a verdict handed down to Marjorie. She was no longer the law in Oak Ridge. but a figure brought before justice. The light-colored suit that once symbolized authority turned into wrinkled cloth, the neatly styled hair into a tangled mess, and the once confident eyes into hollow pits of despair. Everything she had once used to suppress others' power, money, fear, now turned back to crush her. I witnessed the change from within the community itself. People who once sat silently through meetings now spoke up in protest. Families who used to bow their heads at absurd fines now raised their hands, demanding transparency and fairness. Children ran freely in the streets without fear of being stopped, and adults chatted openly in front yards without the weight of surveillance. Oak Ridge, once riddled with fear, had become a neighborhood of trust and voice, and it all started with one seemingly small act: rebuilding a mailbox out of steel. To me, the most precious thing was the look in my daughter's eyes. She looked at me not just with the pride a child feels for her father, but with the belief justice is real, that it can exist before our eyes if we have the strength to hold the line. I had taught her something simple but vital. No one has the right to trample another because of skin color or money. If anyone tries, truth will eventually bring them down. And she smiled, looking at the mailbox shining bright like a milestone she would remember forever. As this story comes to a close, it leaves behind lessons far deeper than personal revenge. First is that silence feeds darkness. Injustice doesn't thrive because the wicked are strong, but because the good choose to bow their head. The second is that justice sometimes begins with the smallest of acts: a mailbox, a word spoken aloud, a stand taken. Any of these can spark a greater change. And the final lesson is that justice belongs to no one alone. When one person rises, the rest of the community will find the courage to step into the light together. I close this journey with a sense of relief. Marjorie is now just the path. While Oak Ridge has entered a new chapter, the steel mailbox still stands, a reminder that justice isn't distant. It lives in every choice we make. I smile, whispering as if to myself, this wasn't my victory, but the victory of everyone who's ever been oppressed, of everyone who believes that no matter how deeply the truth is buried, it will find a way to rise. And if there's one message I could leave behind, it would be this: justice doesn't reside in grand building or depend on powerful seat. It begins the moment an ordinary person dares to say, enough. When we refuse to bow, when we hold fast to the truth, then whether through a steel mailbox or through our own voice, we can push the darkness back. Oak Ridge proved that, and I believe it holds true anywhere.